What makes an image scary? Since we're in Spooktober, I wanted to make this video analyzing the different components that go into making artwork creepy or unnerving. In 2019, I painted this illustration here of a giant squid in an aquarium with hundreds of people looking on and taking photos of it. While I was happy with it at the time, I've always wanted to come back and repaint this illustration to make it feel a little bit more ambiguous and unnerving. The reason this image is not as creepy as it could be is because everything is far too detailed and there's a lack of intention of where I want you to look. Also, while you do see the scale of the squid in relation to the crowd, I also feel that the perspective could be pushed way more. When I look at the early sketches for this piece, I actually find that some of the initial thumbnails felt way creepier than what the illustration ended up being. So this year, I decided to revisit the illustration, adding the three main components of what I think make an image scary. And they are ambiguity, familiarity, and lighting. My favorite aspect of horror is that as a genre, you can really do whatever it is you want. I also find that it has the most amount of room for creative exploration, and a lot of it can be very personal too. Anyway, let's get straight into it. I am both fascinated and terrified of our oceans. You may be familiar with the term thalassophobia, which is the fear of extremely deep bodies of water. Now, since so much of the ocean is unexplored, it's crazy to think of how many deep sea discoveries we're still yet to have. In particular, there's this Easter egg in Destiny 2 that immediately hooked my attention. On Titan, there's a section where you're underneath the waves and see this giant glass panel. And if you actually wait there long enough, you see this giant shadow start to appear and swim across the glass panels, which is just super creepy. I love everything about this, and from also playing games like Subnautica, I wanted to show the sense of danger and scale from something so massive just outside a glass panel. So in my illustration, whether or not the squid is inside a giant aquarium or it's a glass panel at the bottom of the ocean was for the viewer to decide. Ambiguity is a huge tool that can be used to make images feel scary. Now, it's all well and good to have horrific creature designs or spooky apparitions in your works, but once we see the tangible danger, we're able to categorize it and understand it a little better. It's much more effective to have something that remains ambiguous, so our brains have to fill in the detail of what's there. It's kind of like the difference between terror and horror. Horror is categorized as seeing the scary thing, the chase, fighting for survival. But terror is that state when you're unsure. It's instead seeing that shadow at the end of your corridor and not knowing if it's an intruder or just a pile of clothes. I have definitely been jump scared by my jacket in my room so many times, it's not even funny. For the new squid illustration, I wanted to recapture some of that intrigue I had in my original designs from 2019. I felt like the tentacles would be a great thing to focus on, so rather than showing and detailing the rest of the squid, I chose to purposely leave it unrendered and just represented through a simple flat shape. The biggest change I made going from the original illustration to now was changing the aspect ratio from horizontal to vertical. Now I had a lot more room to play with scale since the camera is lower. This also gave me the opportunity to use a 3-point perspective setup to reinforce these vertical lines. So I played around with a bunch of different compositions before ultimately settling on these two here, and asked you guys on Instagram which one you thought was scarier. What I found pretty interesting is that for the most part, the poll was actually quite even. I also had a few DMs from you arguing for one over the other. For example, image A feels a lot more imposing because of the sense of scale and perspective of the squid looming over the crowd. But in image B, it's a lot more ambiguous because all you see is the tentacles swimming across. Now it feels like some kind of alien creature, and because we can't determine if it's an immediate threat or not, it becomes way more ambiguous. So as you can see, from an artistic point of view, either image could have worked, but I decided to go with A because I really wanted this sense of scale and perspective to be the thing carrying this image. The threat comes from the fact that the squid is so massive that it probably wouldn't even register a person if they swam alongside it. What I find to be a great example of ambiguity comes from this piece by artist Alex Konstad. Alex does tons of great horror art, but this piece in particular is my favorite. Everything about it feels super ominous. It feels really intrusive that these creepy deities are watching this couple camping, and while an attack hasn't occurred yet, everything from the low camera angle to the way these tall figures are cropped by their necks so we can't see their face makes our brains go into overdrive. Who knows what they're gonna do? When it comes to effective horror, I also think alongside ambiguity, there needs to be a sense of familiarity mixed in. If you're familiar with the uncanny valley, then you'll definitely relate to this. While the uncanny valley is mostly used to describe people's faces, going from realistic to just a little bit strange to downright nightmare feel, I also find that this can really include anything. While I'm not dissing horror when it comes to sci-fi or fantasy, because Alien is one of my favorite films, I find that it just hits way harder when it's set in our real world. For example, I'm gonna assume that probably not many of us have been to space or live on an off-world mining colony, but a lot more of us understand what it's like walking down an empty corridor at night. For the squid illustration, I decided to set it in an aquarium to bring forward the sense of familiarity. Being underwater is already a fairly inhospitable place for us, so I wanted to show this monstrous being separated from a crowd of people with just a glass panel. Who knows, maybe after this image was done, the squid decided to break the glass, or maybe it swam away in a giant cloud of black ink, making everything dark as it escaped. To give the illustration some extra depth, I also added these giant pieces of kelp in the foreground and background. The kelp reinforced that sense of perspective as they trail upwards around the squid, but also helped to obscure it slightly. I just find the idea of kelp forests creepy anyway, because there could really be anything hiding around, or tucked away out of sight, especially if you look down and the kelp just kept going forever and ever. I might be wrong, but I'm pretty sure kelp doesn't grow to be this massive in real life, and this is also why I added a little shark here as another scale cue. Of course, this was partly inspired by the Jurassic World series, but it's definitely an effective way of showing how big something is in relation to something else we're already familiar with. This piece here by Simon Stollenhag demonstrates how familiarity and ambiguity can mix to create an effective horror image. This is taken from his book called The Electric State and showcases a decommissioned robot peering out of a barn. The creepy smile and the hand waving out into the darkness is already terrifying enough, but made more so from the fact that it's a recognizable real-world environment. Perhaps this is more down to personal preference and taste than anything else, but this is why I decided to set my squid illustration in an aquarium rather than an alien planet, for example. The last thing I'd like to take a look at in creating scary images is lighting. Having intent behind your lighting is always important in art, but in horror specifically, it gives you the chance to obscure and withhold information to reinforce your subject. You can do lighting coming from the front or the back, behind, side to side, whatever you want. The interplay of light and shadow is an important element. Now, of course, there's no rules, so you can do horror in the daytime, but I just find that it's a lot harder to pull off. And if you're creating your own artworks, I would recommend leaning heavily towards one side, such as 80% shadows for instance. Unnatural lighting is also effective in this regard, like a torchlight being placed underneath a face. In this illustration, I started painting up until this stage before realizing that something felt really off. Before I give you the answer, I'm gonna let you have a look and decide for yourself what it could be. Okay, so if you said it was the bright light at the top, then you're absolutely correct. I initially placed this bright light up at the top because I wanted to have a little bit more contrast in the image, and while this is typical for any other illustration, I find that it takes away from this one. In this case, I realized I needed to tone it down since having a bright highlight made the water feel really shallow and therefore made the squid feel smaller. The environment needed to reflect the conditions a beast of this size would be in, so I made the water murkier and darker. I also decided on a green palette to give off this kind of sickly green glow instead of a typical deep blue you might see in aquariums. I did play around with this blue color palette, but ultimately I listened to my instinct, which was to make it feel a little bit more like Bioshock. For the actual values of the squid, you'll notice that I reserved the most amount of contrast for this tentacle right here in the foreground. This was actually following my original plan all the way back in 2019, and actually something I always wish I kept in the original painting. The fact that you can see the suckers as it turns toward the glass feels like a very memorable and striking visual that I definitely wanted to keep now. But something I did want to experiment with was changing the lighting style entirely. Squids, of course, are usually at the very deepest parts of the ocean where there's no sunlight at all. So, using what I had, I decided to change the entire lighting setup from this to this. And now there's only two sources of light in the image, one coming from the bottom of the glass panel and the other from the crowd's phones. I think this instantly changes the entire vibe of the image. Whereas the first is maybe more shock and awe with a little bit of creepiness, the second is way more threatening just by changing the lighting scenario. Also, the shark becomes more obvious in the second image as its underside catches the light. A good example of this is from artist Yun Ling in this personal piece here. In this image, we can see the silhouette of a creepy girl holding a teddy, and another version of it with the lights completely turned off, showing the vague silhouette and eyes of the girl. But let me ask you, which one of these do you find more creepy? So all in all, we have the final illustration here, and using everything I've talked about from ambiguity to familiarity and other lighting setups, I think this definitely makes for a much more effective illustration here. It corrected everything that I wanted from the original piece by giving a stronger sense of scale and also reinforcing the focal points a little bit more. When it comes to your own art and projects, I would also think about the subject matter in terms of what scares you specifically. So whether that's a nightmare that you have or something that you just find really, really creepy, you can kind of also infuse that energy a little bit into your own art while keeping in mind ambiguity, familiarity, and lighting as well. So anyway, that's going to bring it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope it was helpful, and until next time, take care and stay safe.